The decision to break up the monotonous 5-hour drive from New York City to Rehoboth Beach was a practical one, born from a desire to avoid an agonizingly early start. In retrospect, it was a decision that would unravel the very fabric of my sense of security, leaving me with a chilling memory that still prickles my skin with goosebumps on the quietest of nights. I had found what appeared to be a bargain on a travel app, a $50 night motel room in a town I'd never heard of called Milford, Delaware. The photos were deceptively charming, showcasing a rustic, albeit small, space that seemed perfect for a few hours of shut-eye. That exchange with the owner was the first red flag. A fluttering banner of unease in a sea of digital pleasantries. His messages were curt, almost cryptic, and it took an unusual amount of back and forth to simply confirm the booking. He mentioned his father would leave the key in a lockbox and then, almost as an afterthought, added a peculiar detail. There will be quite a bit of tropical plants in the kitchen. I couldn't move them out on such short notice. I brushed it off. Plants. Strange, but hardly a deal-breaker. I was a seasoned traveler, accustomed to the quirks of budget accommodations. A few overgrown ferns were the least of my worries. By the time my car rolled into Milford, the clock was ticking past 11:30. The town was a pocket of deep rural darkness, a stark contrast to the perpetual twilight of the city I had left behind. The motel was situated in a small, gated community of about 15 or 20 houses, a detail that should have been comforting but instead felt isolating. The absolute silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of gravel under my tires. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy, expectant. Finding the right unit. I retrieved my duffel bag, backpack, and a couple of jackets from the car. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. The process of retrieving the key from the lockbox and turning it in the lock seemed to amplify the silence into a deafening roar. The click and tumble of the lock echoed unnervingly in the stillness. It was in that moment, with my hand on the cold metal doorknob, that the first wave of a powerful gut feeling washed over me, a primal, instinctual warning that I was about to step into a place I should not be. I pushed the door open and was immediately greeted by the sight that had been so casually mentioned. The kitchen was a veritable jungle. Large, leafy tropical plants of all shapes and sizes were crammed onto every available surface, their waxy leaves glistening under the single, dim overhead light. The air was thick with the cloying, humid smell of soil and vegetation. It was bizarre, but still, I tried to rationalize it as the eccentricity of a plant-loving owner. I dropped my bags on a worn-out recliner in the living room and began to take a proper look around. The living room was decently sized but sparsely furnished with mismatched, dated furniture. It was the first bedroom that truly set my teeth on edge. The room was filled, and I mean filled, with dolls, dozens of them, all seemingly from the 1950s, with their porcelain faces, glassy, unblinking eyes, and prim, old-fashioned dresses. They were perched on shelves, propped up against the walls, and even sat in a small, child-sized rocking chair in the center of the room. 2 twin-sized mattresses lay directly on the floor, stripped bare of any sheets or bedding. The collective gaze of those dolls seemed to follow me, a silent, unnerving audience. I backed out slowly and shut the door. The second bedroom was no less peculiar. This room's theme was nutcrackers. Wooden soldiers of varying heights and expressions stood sentinel on every flat surface. A single bed, covered with a thin threadbare sheet and no pillows, was pushed against the far wall. I flipped the only light switch in the room. Nothing. The switch was connected to absolutely nothing, plunging the room into near total darkness save for the sliver of light from the hallway. The thought of sleeping in a dark room surrounded by those wooden figures with their perpetually grinning mouths was deeply unsettling. Defeated, I decided the couch in the living room was my only viable option. It was small and lumpy, but at least it wasn't in a room full of silent, staring figures. By now, the initial unease had blossomed into a full-blown sense of discomfort. I was hungry, and a quick search on my phone revealed a single food line, a beacon of normalcy in the encroaching weirdness that was closing in 15 minutes. The drive there was a welcome, albeit brief, respite. I grabbed a box of pizza bites and a peach Snapple, a pathetic but comforting meal, and headed back. It was during that short trip to the grocery store that a sliver of paranoia, or perhaps foresight, prompted me to set up my GoPro. I placed it on top of a bookshelf, angled towards the living room and the front door. When I returned, the first thing I did was scan the apartment, my eyes darting into every corner, checking to see if anything was out of place. Everything was exactly as I had left it. A small measure of relief trickled through me. I retrieved the SD card from the GoPro and slid it into my laptop, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. The footage showed nothing but the still, silent room. No movement, no unexpected visitors. That it was well past midnight. The combination of a full day's work and the long drive had left me exhausted, yet sleep remained elusive. The apartment's only television, a tiny 19-inch relic, had no power cable. The outlet by the couch was just out of reach for my phone charger, and to make matters worse, I had no cell service. The little glowing bars on my phone screen were empty. I was cut off. I left the main light on, a childish comfort against the oppressive darkness that seemed to be pressing in from the windows after an hour of tossing and turning on the lumpy couch. Nature called. The bathroom was a jarringly bright, neon yellow, the sickly hue amplified by a single dim bulb. The shower had no curtain, just a stained, tiled stall that seemed to yawn into the small space. The kitchen, I had noted earlier, had hardwood floors, the kind that screeched in protest at the slightest movement of furniture. This seemingly innocuous detail would soon become the centerpiece of my terror. As I sat in the bathroom, the only reading material available was the back of a shampoo bottle. My phone, my only connection to the outside world, was charging uselessly in the living room. It was in this moment of mundane vulnerability that I heard it, a sound that made the blood in my veins turn to ice, the distinct, unmistakable screech of a wooden chair being dragged across the hardwood floor of the kitchen. It wasn't a sudden, accidental noise. It was slow, deliberate, the sound of someone pulling a chair out from a table to sit down. My breath hitched in my throat. I was frozen, every muscle in my body tensed. And then, it got worse. A new sound began, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the wooden kitchen table. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of impatient fingers drumming against wood, the tempo gradually increasing, a frantic, unnerving beat in the crushing silence. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently I thought it would burst. The world seemed to shrink to the confines of that sickly yellow bathroom. I messed up. I whispered to myself the words, a mantra of my own foolishness. I repeated it over and over, my mind racing, trying to process the impossible reality of the situation. The tapping stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving a silence that was even more terrifying. I stayed in the bathroom for what felt like an eternity, but it was likely only 2 or 3 minutes, debating my next move. Staying in here forever, that was not an option. Whoever, or whatever, was out there knew I was in here. The element of surprise was gone. A surge of adrenaline, born of pure terror, propelled me to my feet. My mind latched onto the one tangible source of protection I had, the Bowie knife I always kept in my backpack when I traveled. I decided I wasn't going to be a passive victim. I would burst out, grab the knife, and fight. I braced myself, took a deep breath, and flung the bathroom door open with a yell that was more of a strangled cry. I burst into the living room, my eyes wide, scanning every inch of the space. Nothing. No one was there. The kitchen was empty. I flicked my gaze to the kitchen table. The chairs were all pushed in, exactly as they had been. There was no sign that anything had been moved, no trace of the presence that had filled me with such primal fear. The apartment was as still and silent as it had been when I first arrived. I didn't waste another second. I didn't check the doll room or the nutcracker room. Frantic energy seized me, and I began throwing my belongings into my bags with a speed I didn't know I possessed. The place was no longer just creepy. It felt tainted, malevolent. I fled that apartment as if it were on fire, my heart still pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I got in my car, locked the doors, and sped out of that silent, dark community, not daring to look back. The drive to the Holiday Inn in Rehoboth Beach, which was an hour away, was a blur. I arrived at the hotel at 3 in the morning, looking like I had seen a ghost. I stumbled to the front desk, my voice trembling as I recounted the night's events to the bewildered night clerk. He must have seen the genuine terror in my eyes, because, without hesitation, he checked me into a room early, a king-size suite that felt like a palace after the nightmare I had just escaped. The room that had been reserved for me for later that day wasn't even ready, but he made it happen. As I finally lay in a clean, safe bed, the first rays of dawn beginning to streak the sky, I couldn't shake the sounds from that apartment. The screech of the chair, the rhythmic tapping of unseen fingers. There was no rational explanation. It was a place of deep, unsettling wrongness. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I had not been alone in that $50 motel room in Milford, Delaware. The motel, a tired 3-story building nestled in a less than glamorous corner of London, was my nocturnal kingdom. I was the night receptionist, a role that was often more about battling boredom than dealing with drama. Most nights were a slow, quiet crawl towards dawn, marked by the turning pages of a magazine and the lukewarm sips of instant coffee. The guests were usually weary travelers, faces etched with the fatigue of the road, seeking nothing more than a clean bed and 2 hours of undisturbed sleep. But the night of the 22nd of November was different. It was a night that would etch itself into my memory with the sharp, jagged edges of fear. The evening had started like any other. A cold, persistent drizzle slicked the London streets, and a damp chill seemed to seep through the very walls of the motel. The lobby, with its worn-out furniture and dim, flickering lights, felt particularly lonely. The old radiator in the corner hummed a monotonous tune, its valiant but ultimately failing effort to ward off the cold. I was deep into an article about a celebrity scandal when the rusty bell above the door chimed, its jarring clang startling me as it always did. He stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the rainy streetlights. As he stepped into the weak light of the lobby, My initial surprise curdled into a vague sense of unease. He was a man of average height, but there was an unsettling intensity about him. His hair was a greasy, matted mess, sticking out at odd angles as if he'd been running his hands through it in a state of perpetual agitation. Dark, hollowed-out circles framed his eyes, making them seem sunken and haunted. His clothes were rumpled and stained, carrying the faint, sour smell of someone who had been sleeping rough. He approached the reception desk with a nervous, shuffling gait, his eyes darting around the empty lobby as if expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. My job required me to be polite and professional to everyone, but a primal instinct, a tiny voice in the back of my mind, screamed that something was wrong with this man. He paid for a room in cash, his hand trembling slightly as he pushed a wad of crumpled notes across the counter. He mumbled something incoherent when I handed him the key, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. I watched him disappear down the long, dimly lit corridor, a knot of apprehension tightening in my stomach. I hoped he would just go to his room and sleep, that his strange demeanor was simply a product of exhaustion. For the next hour, a deceptive calm settled over the motel. I tidied up the lobby, refilled the coffee machine, and tried to lose myself in my magazine again. But the image of the man's haunted eyes kept swimming before my own. Just after midnight, the silence was broken. Faint at first, then growing louder, were the sounds of movement from the corridor. A scraping noise, like heavy furniture being dragged across the floor, followed by muffled, agitated voices. It sounded like he was arguing with someone, though. I had seen him enter the room alone. Annoyance warred with a growing sense of dread. I left the sanctuary of the reception desk and walked down the hallway, the threadbare carpet muffling my footsteps. As I neared his room, the sound stopped abruptly. I pressed my ear against the cold wood of the door but heard nothing but a profound, unnerving silence. I convinced myself that my tired mind was playing tricks on me, that the old building was simply groaning under the strain of the wind and rain. I had just settled back into my chair when the sounds erupted again, this time with a terrifying violence. A door slammed with such force that the walls seemed to shudder. My heart leaped into my throat. I jumped up and ran back down the hallway, my earlier annoyance now replaced with genuine fear. Before I could even reach his room, the door was flung open, and the man stumbled out into the hallway, his eyes wide with a frantic, unseeing terror. He pushed past me, his breathing ragged and shallow, and without a word, he lurched into the empty room directly across the hall. Confused and deeply worried, I followed him, my mind struggling to make sense of his erratic behavior. I found him standing in the middle of the room, muttering to himself in a frantic, incoherent stream of words. He grabbed the mattress of the unmade bed and, with a surge of manic strength, flipped it completely off the bed frame. He then began to tear at the sheets, his fingers clawing at the fabric as if he were desperately searching for something hidden within. "Sir," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Sir, you need to calm down. What's wrong?" My words were like stones dropped into a raging river. They had no effect. He continued his rampage, tossing pillows, lamps, and the bedside table aside with a careless, destructive force. The room was quickly devolving into chaos. I knew I was out of my depth. I needed help. As I turned to run back to the lobby to call the police, I heard footsteps in the hallway. A wave of immense relief washed over me as I saw my friend, Jack, appear in the doorway. Jack was a security guard for a nearby office building, and he often dropped by during his late-night patrols to chat and break the monotony of our respective shifts. He was a tall, solidly built man with a calm, reassuring presence that had diffused more than one tense situation in the past without a moment's hesitation. Jack stepped into the room. "Hey mate," he said in a low, soothing voice. "What's going on here? Let's all just take a deep breath." He approached the man slowly, his hands held up in a non-threatening gesture. But the stranger was beyond reason. He let out a guttural roar and lunged at Jack, his fists flying in a wild frenzy. The small motel room became a battleground. Jack, though strong and experienced, was caught off guard by the sheer ferocity of the attack. They wrestled and grappled, crashing against the walls and furniture. I stood frozen in the doorway, a silent, horrified witness to the violence unfolding before me. The sounds of their struggle, the grunts of exertion, the thud of bodies hitting the floor, filled the small space. Finally, with a grunt of effort, Jack managed to get the upper hand. He pinned the man to the floor, his weight holding him down. "Call the police," he yelled at me, his voice strained. Now, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the bedside phone. I fumbled with the buttons, my fingers feeling clumsy and unresponsive. I finally managed to dial 999, my voice a panicked squeak as I explained the situation to the calm, professional dispatcher on the other end of the line. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Jack struggled to keep the man restrained as he thrashed and screamed, his voice a raw, animalistic sound of rage and despair. The wail of sirens, growing steadily louder, was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The police burst into the room, two uniformed officers taking control of the situation with a practiced efficiency. They carefully lifted the stranger off the floor, his resistance continuing even as they snapped handcuffs around his wrists. he screamed and thrashed, a torrent of incomprehensible words pouring from his lips as they escorted him out of the motel and into the cold, rainy night. With the man gone, an eerie silence descended upon the trashed room. The overturned furniture, the shredded bedding, the general air of destruction stood as a stark testament to the chaos that had just unfolded. The rest of the night was a blur of police statements and paperwork. Jack, his knuckles bruised and his shirt torn, sat beside me, his presence a comforting anchor in the disorienting aftermath. Several other guests, awakened by the commotion, gave their statements, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. We later learned that the man had a history of similar incidents, fueled by a toxic cocktail of mental health issues and substance abuse. Knowing the reason behind his behavior did little to soothe the ragged edges of my fear. The image of his wild, desperate eyes was burned into my memory as dawn finally broke, casting a pale gray light over the rain-soaked city. My shift ended. I walked home through the quiet streets, a bone-deep weariness settling over me. The experience had shattered my sense of security, revealing the fragile veneer of normalcy that separated a quiet night from a terrifying ordeal. I continued to work at the motel, but every time the lobby door creaked open in the dead of night, my heart would leap into my throat, and I would be transported back to the night of the midnight guest. A high school history trip to Belgium was supposed to be the highlight of our GCSE year. We were a group of 16-year-olds, giddy with the freedom of being in a foreign country without our parents, our minds filled with images of Belgian waffles, historic battlefields, and the kind of adventures that would become legendary stories to tell for years to come. We had no idea that the most enduring story from that trip would be one of a dark, creeping horror that would follow us home and linger in the shadows of our memories. Our descent into that nightmare began when our bus, after a long day of travel, pulled up to a motel on the outskirts of a small, forgotten-looking town. The building was a relic from another era, a gabled two-story structure that looked as if it had been slowly surrendering to the relentless creep of time. The paint was peeling in long curling strips, revealing the dark weathered wood beneath. Ivy, thick and gnarled like skeletal fingers, clawed its way up the walls, its leaves obscuring some of the windows. Our teacher, the ever-optimistic Mr. Thompson, assured us with a strained smile that it was the only accommodation available for miles. With a collective sigh of teenage disappointment, we shuffled off the bus and into the gloom. The lobby was no more inviting than the exterior. The air was thick with the musty, cloying smell of dust and damp. The receptionist, a gaunt, sallow-faced woman with eyes that seemed to hold a deep, weary sadness, slid a set of keys across the counter. "You're on the top floor," she said, her voice a dry, rustling whisper. "The only room up there," and a word of advice: "Stay out of the basement." The warning was delivered with a chilling finality, leaving no room for questions. We were too tired and too eager to settle in to give it much thought at the time. The climb to the top floor was a journey in itself. The stairs creaked and groaned under our weight, each step a protest from the ancient wood. The hallway was a long, narrow tunnel of shadows, lit by a single flickering bulb that cast long, dancing silhouettes on the faded floral wallpaper. A profound sense of unease settled over me, a feeling that we were treading where we were not welcome. Our room was at the very end of the hall. The door, with its peeling paint and tarnished brass knob, seemed to sigh open, revealing a space that felt like a time capsule from the 1970s. The furniture was a collection of mismatched, dark wood pieces, their surfaces scarred with the rings of countless forgotten glasses. The curtains, thin and threadbare, did little to keep out the dying light of the afternoon, which filtered through the grimy windows in dusty, ethereal beams. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of old fabric and something else, something vaguely metallic and unpleasant. We claimed our beds, the springs groaning in protest as we tossed our bags down. No one was in a hurry to explore the rest of the motel. The receptionist's warning about the basement seemed to hang in the air, an unspoken taboo. As dusk bled into night, the darkness outside seemed to seep into the room, pressing in on us, making the already cramped space feel claustrophobic. Mr. Thompson, in an attempt to lift our spirits, suggested we order pizza and watch a movie on his laptop. But even the promise of food and entertainment couldn't dispel the palpable tension that had settled over the room. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every creak of the floorboards from the empty hallway outside, every rustle of the ivy against the windowpane sent a shiver down my spine. The inevitable need to use the bathroom became a source of shared dread. It was a small, dingy space with cracked, yellowed tiles and a single flickering light that cast a sickly, pulsating glow. The mirror above the sink was spotted with age, reflecting a distorted, ghostly version of myself. I hesitated at the door, a primal fear of what might be lurking in the shadows of the small room making me reluctant to enter alone. But my bladder won the silent battle. As I washed my hands, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was a tangible presence, a prickling on the back of my neck that made the hairs stand on end. I felt as if a pair of unseen eyes were boring into me from just beyond the cracked, warped door. I fumbled with the handle, my heart hammering against my ribs, and hurried back to the relative safety of the main room, trying to ignore the icy knot of fear in the pit of my stomach. When I voiced my unease, my classmates tried to laugh it off, blaming my nerves on the creepy old building, but I could see the flicker of shared fear in their eyes. As the night deepened, the strange occurrences began. An object on a bedside table, a tube of chapstick, slid to the floor with a soft clatter, though no one was near it. Faint, whispering sounds seemed to emanate from the walls, too faint to be understood but clear enough to be unsettling. A cold spot developed in the center of the room, a pocket of icy air that had nothing to do with a draft. We tried to rationalize it all, our teenage bravado warring with a growing, primal fear. It was just the old building settling, we told ourselves. Our imaginations were running wild, but deep down, we knew something was terribly wrong. Just as we were starting to succumb to an exhausted, uneasy truce with our fear, a scream ripped through the silence of the motel. It was a raw, blood-curdling sound of pure terror, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, that we all shot up in our beds, our hearts pounding in a frantic, syncopated rhythm. The scream echoed through the empty hallways, a terrifying testament to the fact that we were not alone in our fear. We scrambled out of our beds and huddled together in the center of the room, a tight knot of terrified teenagers, too scared to move, too scared to speak. Mr. Thompson, his face pale and his own fear evident in his wide eyes, tried to reassure us, but his words were hollow, lost in the echoing silence that followed the scream. We debated calling the police, but the thought of leaving the relative safety of our locked room to navigate the dark, creaking hallways was even more terrifying. We didn't know where the scream had come from, or what might be lurking out there in the darkness, so we waited. We sat in a terrified, silent vigil, listening to the old motel groan and sigh around us. Every sound magnified 1,000 times by our fear. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Slowly, imperceptibly, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. One by one, we drifted off into a fitful, nightmare-plagued sleep, huddled together for a warmth that was more psychological than physical. When we awoke the next morning, the first rays of dawn were filtering through the grimy windows, illuminating a room that was eerily quiet. There was no sign of the commotion from the night before, no evidence that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. We gathered our belongings in a dazed silence, the shared trauma of the night hanging heavy and unspoken between us as we made our way back down the creaking stairs and through the musty lobby. The gaunt receptionist was nowhere to be seen. We didn't stop. We didn't look back. We filed onto the bus, a somber, shaken group of kids who had aged a decade in a single night. As the bus pulled away from the curb, I chanced a final glance back at the motel. The building seemed to watch us go, its ivy-covered walls holding its dark secrets close. And as we rounded a bend in the road, the motel disappearing from view, I couldn't help but wonder about the source of that blood-curdling scream, and what other horrors lay dormant in the shadows of that run-down building, waiting for the next unsuspecting travelers to arrive.